My name is Conrad and I'll be taking you through the 5 essential tips for troubleshooting Tomcat. So let's first look at the contents of what I'll be covering. I'm going to do a short introduction of myself. Then I'll be taking you to what is Tomcat in Sage CRM. And then I'll be covering my 5 tips. So let's start off. My name is Conrad Roo. I work for Sage South Africa and I've been with Sage for about 8 years now. My background is mainly in development and I've been a developer for 12 years now. And I work mainly with CRM when it comes to POCs for clients, as well as integration into CRM and other third-party applications that need to communicate with CRM. So let's start right off. What is Tomcat in Sage CRM and what does it do? Well, Tomcat is a Java servlet or JSP written in Java. Okay, so what does it do? Think about Tomcat as a IIS for Java pages. Okay, so what is Tomcat effectively? Tomcat is a service that runs on our server with a port number, and it can accept requests to that port number and send results back through that port number. Okay? Java should not be confused with JavaScript, as JavaScript is a scripting language that you use in the front end of browsers for interactivity, and Java is a compiled language. Okay, so what does this Apache Tomcat do for us? Well, there's a couple of features that's dependent on Sage CRM, like the interactive dashboards, the calendar, S-Data or the REST web service, mail merge, and as well as certain document functionality, like uploading of documents, is dependent on Tomcat. Okay, so how does it work? Well, Tomcat accepts a redirect from CRM or a browser into the service, generates whatever the JavaScript page needs to generate, the content that you're looking for, and then sends it back either to CRM to display in the front end or send it directly back to the client browser. Now, what is a redirection then? Redirection is basically when information or a request comes into a site through IIS. That site can either deal with it itself and represent the content back, or when the site accepts a certain request, it can redirect it to a different service or site where it will handle the request, send it back to the originating site, and then back to the client browser. I did a little representation of that here, where I show the client browser sending a request to our IIS server where CRM is installed. The request ends up there, then IIS will see where it needs to go. So if our domain name is example.com and it's going to our CRM install, it will go down the bottom path to the eWare DLL, where it will get intercepted by the eWare DLL, the content will get generated and sent back. However, the eWare DLL can make its own requests to the Tomcat service. Also, if a request comes into IIS and it's got our domain, which is example.com/sdata instead of our CRM install, it can actually redirect directly to the Tomcat service. And this is what happens when you do RESTful calls into CRM. It will go to the Tomcat service will fetch its data and then send it back to the S-Data site, which will then get redirected back to the client browser for viewing. In IIS, this is the sort of setup that you will see. So we see under sites, we've got our default website. So if it was example.com, our default website would be example.com. And then we've got our CRM site, which will be our CRM install. And then we've got our S-Data site. For every CRM install, you'll always see a different site name. So it could be CRM, it could be CRM 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how many CRM installs you have, but there will always only be one S-Data site. Okay, and then on the right hand side, you can see our rewrite rules. We'll be talking about these a little bit later. Okay, so how do we know if my Tomcat's working? So How do we know if Tomcat's broken, what's wrong with Tomcat, what's going on in the back end? Okay, so this is what we're going to discuss today. So firstly, the best thing to do is always test, is open up CRM and see. Launch CRM as the first thing you do would always be go to your dashboard, as it is the default with most user configurations. However, if you just click on the dashboard and it loads and you see a fantastic dashboard with all your gadgets, then you know everything's fine and working. However, if you see a grey dashboard with this message on it, then you know something's wrong and you need to start investigating. How do you investigate? Well, let's start with the system health and logs. So the system health feature has been available since CRM 2017. And what it does for us is it monitors our CRM system without the need for us to go in, log into the server physically and then look at anything on the server like, are these services started? Is this specific component working? This basically brings it all together so we can see all our components from one place. So you can see there that we have got Apache Tomcat. Is the Windows server started? Is it running? We've got our URL rewriter function. We've got our sdata functions and our quick finds and so on and so forth. Okay. The second thing we can look at is our logs. So our log location for our Tomcat logs sits in our install directory for CRM, then our instance name for CRM, then /Tomcat and logs. For every instance of CRM, there is an instance of Tomcat. It runs separately on its own and it doesn't get affected by other instances. So now you might be thinking, well, is there multiple services for Tomcat if we have multiple installs on the same machine? And the answer is yes. It will point to each one of that installs instance with a name appended to it. Okay. So back to the logs. What are we looking for in the logs? Well, our main logs are the Catalina logs, the CRM Tomcat stderr logs, the localhost access logs, and the localhost logs. Those are our main logs that we can look at. There are a few more of them as well. And when we open our logs, remember to always scroll to the bottom of the log, as all information gets appended to the bottom of the log. And what we're basically looking for is something like severe. So if we see a severe message, we know something's wrong and something's broken, and we need to take heed of those messages and see what is actually going on in Tomcat. Okay, let's look at the next thing. So let's say we looked at our logs and we didn't see much in our logs. Let's see if our service is actually running and if it's pointing to the correct port. Now earlier I spoke about the service running and about the ports. What basically happens is when a service runs in Windows, it has a port number. That port number we can use to send data to that service. Okay, so Tomcat is no different. When Tomcat runs in our server, it runs on a port and it's got a process ID that it runs with. Okay, so let's have a look. The first thing we can check out is if we go to our location where our install of CRM is and our instance, and then the Tomcat folder and the conf folder and the server XML file. If you scroll down in that file, you'll find something called the connector port. Now, connector port tells Tomcat service where to start on which port and how to accept communications. So it's telling me that my connector port in this case is 10,001. Okay, so it'll be running on the 10,001 connector port. Let's go check in command prompt if it's actually that what it's running on. So if we open command prompt and we type in netstat-ano space vertical bar find and then the port number that we just got from the server XML file, it'll show me that there's currently one process by number 2540 running on this server, and it's got two connections, which is exactly what I'm looking for. So I know that 2540 belongs to some kind of service. If I now go into my services and I check for that service, if there is a service running with 2540, you will see that it is definitely your Tomcat service. Now your services could have different numbers, but this one is my process ID number. Okay, the next thing we can do now, we made sure that the logs are all fine and that our Tomcat is running on the correct port, and we know the Tomcat's running because it started and it's got a process ID. We can verify SQL database connections. So as I mentioned before, Tomcat is a service on its own, which means it's got its own database connection. Yes, it shares the CRM database connection, but it connects to our SQL database with its own means and not through IIS like CRM connects to SQL. So let's go have a look in SQL Server Management Studio if Tomcat's actually connected to our database. This way we know that if Tomcat is connected, then we can go to the next step. If Tomcat is not connected, we need to fix this connection and get Tomcat to connect to our database first. So what you're going to do in Management Studio is you will launch something called Activity Monitor. Okay, you can do it with the shortcut Control-Alt-A. And when you've got Activity Monitor open, what you need to do is open the Processes tab, go to Database, then filter on your CRM database name, so mine is CRM, and then go to the Applications column, and then filter on Microsoft JDBC driver for SQL Server. If you see no connections there, we know Tomcat isn't connected, and we need to check our database settings for Tomcat. If you see your connections there, then you know you don't need to check it. So let's look at what happens if there isn't a connection. Well, the first thing you need to do is go check the Tomcat config files. So you'll go into the install directory, then your instance name, then Tomcat, web apps, then CRM instance name. So if it was called CRM, it would be CRM and then the J. So you can't forget the J. The J is very important there. If you leave out the J, you won't see the folder structure that you're looking for. So it's instance name J, web-inf, and then there'll be a file called db.properties. There's a few things in the db.properties file, but what you're mainly looking for is the db.url, db.username, and db.password. So with the db.url, you'll see that it has a portion called SQL Server, and that is my SQL Server with my port number and my database name for my CRM database, as well as language equals English, which is the default for my server. Then the DB username is my SQL username, and then the DB password you'll see is an encrypted password. Now, what do we do if the password has actually changed and I need to now put in the changed password? Well, luckily you don't have to figure out what the encryption is. You can put in a plain text password into that field, and Tomcat will realize that it's a plain text password. It will still try to connect with the plain text password instead of the encrypted password. If it manages to connect with the plain text password, you'll be able to see it in Management Studio, and then you know that your connection has gone through. However, that plain text password will not be encrypted again. What you need to do is go into the registry keys for CRM and get the encrypted password from the registry keys back and put it in this password's place. That will then fix the encryption. If you, however, don't do that, it will leave your SA password or whatever database user password you're using, will leave it as unencrypted, which could be seen as a security risk if someone knows where to go and look for it. So now that we fixed the connection and it's connecting and still it doesn't work, well, next step, verify your redirection in IIS. So the redirection rules that I spoke about earlier gets used for when a request comes into IIS and it needs to get redirected to our Tomcat service. So what basically happens here is a request comes in either to CRM or to the SData site, and SData then needs to follow a set of rules. Those rules are our redirection rules. As you can see here, we've got our standard 5 rules. The CRM J rule, which is normally for retrieving data, like the RESTful web service. Then you've got the sync engine, the exchange sync engine, the SP sync engine, and then the JSPL rules. So even though that I didn't mention it earlier, the exchange sync engine is also part of Tomcat, as well as JSPL, which is the spell checker. Okay. So if you go to the install directory, you can also find a basic text file version of what you see in IIS. So in the install directory, if you go to services, IIS utils, and then CRM rewriter, so this is not for every single install. So remember, I mentioned that for every single install, there will be a CRM site. However, there will always only be one S-data site. And that one S-data site is referencing this IIS utils CRM rewriter web.config file. If you look in that web.config file, you'll see that to the bottom there, it says localhost, and then it's got a port number, 10,001. That is the port number that we checked previously, so we know our URL redirector is working correctly. Next thing to do is we can verify our authentication in IIS and see if Tomcat or the S-data site is using the correct authentication to send to Tomcat. So when we're in IIS and we're on our S-data site, we can check authentication for our site. Now, for S-data, we should only have anonymous authentication enabled. And when you look at the options for anonymous authentication, it can either go with application pool identity or specific user. We normally recommend to go with specific user and then use a user like a domain service account. The next thing to check would be our IIS Handler Mappings. Now, the Handler Mapping is basically when IIS needs to execute something like a DLL or some kind of service, the handler mapping tells it what to do. Handlers are the ones that processes the request made to the site or application, and it maps to a resource on the web server that generates a response for the request. So what we need to make sure is that our ISAPI DLL handler mapping is enabled and that it's got read, script, and execute permissions. All these settings are normally set by default, but because CRM gets installed on so many different environments that sometimes some of these settings are missed. So it's good to check all these settings. That takes me through the entire setup of all our troubleshooting tips. From looking at the logs or the CRM health to setting up authentication, checking the port number, and making sure our services are running. For a bonus tip, you can check out the article that I wrote about Tomcat troubleshooting on Sage City, and here is the link that you can follow for that. Now, if after you've done all of this, you should have a fantastic dashboard that shows you the gadgets that you would like.